In this video, we are going to be looking at the women's suffrage movement, the campaign for all women in Britain to have the right to vote. So let's start towards the end of the 19th century. If you watch the video on Chartism, you'll remember that during the 1800s, the Chartists demanded the right for all men in Britain. Over time, more men were given the right to vote, but women were still excluded from the voting process, and they had no representation in Parliament. From the 1860s, new organisations began to campaign for women's rights. This wasn't just about the vote, it was also about opening up universities to women and allowing married women the right to own property. But there was strong opposition. Even some famous women like Queen Victoria, Florence Nightingale, or Octavia Hill spoke against women's suffrage. There were different arguments against women having the vote. Some believed men and women simply had different roles in society. Women should stay at home and raise children, whilst men worked and took part in politics. There was also a belief at the time that women were overly emotional, who won't make rational political decisions, and that their interests were already represented by their husbands. There were some women's groups that opposed the votes, such as the Mothers' Union, which by the end of the century had around 170,000 members and focused on traditional values such as marriage and motherhood. Now let's look at the women's suffrage movement itself, and there are two major groups that we are going to be looking at. First, the Suffragists, and afterwards, the Suffragettes. So, in 1897, 17 female suffrage organisations joined together to form the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Bit of a mouthful, but they were better known as the Suffragists. The organisation was led by Millicent Fawcett and believed in achieving their aims through peaceful means, staying within the law. A lot of tactics they used were similar to those of the Chartists, such as speeches, petitions, and writing newspaper articles. It was mainly made up from middle and upper class women, and by 1914 they had grown into a powerful organisation with 50,000 members. However, not everyone agreed with the suffragists' slow and peaceful approach. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters founded the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, branching off from the suffragists. This group became known as the Suffragettes, and funny enough, this was actually an insult, as a newspaper tried to mock the suffragists' name, labelling them as the Suffragettes. But the women embraced the term, and it stuck. Their motto was clear: deeds, not words. Believing that petitions and speeches were not enough, they took more militant actions to demand change. Some of the tactics they used were, let's just say, slightly controversial. They would do things such as heckle members of parliament, throw stones at buildings, or chain themselves to buildings. Their methods grabbed headlines, but it also divided opinion. Although many agreed with their aims, they didn't agree with their methods. The suffragettes were the masters of publicity and the media. They had their own newspaper, the Suffragettes, which sold around 20,000 copies a week across the country. If you notice, in a lot of photos they are wearing white, and they did this to stand out in black and white photos, making them instantly recognisable in newspapers. Perhaps the most famous suffragette moment came in 1913, at a horse race called the Epsom Derby. The suffragette Emily Wilding Davison ran onto the track and was struck by the King's horse. She died a few days later. It was unclear about whether she did this on purpose or was trying to stick a suffragette banner on the horse, but she became a martyr and a symbol of the suffragettes, and brought massive public attention to their cause. So the suffragists and the suffragettes were doing their thing, but now you have a great opportunity to see the chance factor as a major cause in this story, as in 1914, World War I broke out. Most women's suffrage groups suspended their campaigns to support the war effort. With millions of men away at war, women stepped into jobs that they had never done before, such as working in certain factories, as bus conductors, civil servants, and even police officers. Although women were usually paid less than men, their contribution proved that they could do the same work as men and played a key role in changing attitudes. When the men returned home at the end of the war, women had to give up their jobs. But the government passed the 1918 Representation of the People Act. This was a landmark law, which not only gave all working class men the vote, but also partial women's suffrage. There were some limitations. It was only legible if these women were aged over 30 and had property qualifications. But it was a major victory for the suffragists and the suffragettes. Then, in 1928, the Equal Franchise Act gave women the same voting rights as men, as all adults aged over 21 had the right to vote. Winning the vote didn't mean complete equality, however. In World War II, something similar happened, as over 7 million women were employed during the war effort and helped to shift attitudes again. Later reforms further increased women's rights, such as the Abortion Act of 1967, legalising abortion. The Divorce Reform Act of 1969 allowed women to end marriages on equal terms with men, and the Equal Pay Act of 1970 stated that women should receive the same pay as men for the same work. The fight for women's suffrage was long, difficult, and often dangerous. The Suffragists and the Suffragettes laid the foundation for not just political rights, but also wider social change in generations of women to come. That ends this video, and in the next one, we'll be looking at minority rights in the 20th century. See you then.